Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you're listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you're a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Dave Specht about how different generations on the ranch can share their long-term goals and work through any differences. Dave is the author of The Farm Whisperer and is a thought leader on topics surrounding generational continuity of farms, ranches, and businesses. His professional mission is to preserve families and perpetuate businesses. Dave has trained 2,500 top advisors/bankers at a private bank on family dynamics and generational wealth issues. He is the creator of the Certificate in Advising Family Enterprises and the co-creator of the Generational Wealth Masterclass with Jay Hughes. Prior to his work at the bank, he founded Advising Generations, a consulting firm, and established the Family Business Management program at the University of Nebraska. Dave lives in Washington State with his wife and 6 children. This conversation is definitely one that you're going to want to catch every second of and then listen to again. Folks, remember, if you are looking for a speaker who can relate to ranchers, truly resonate with your audience, and get real about the realities of the cattle world, I'm booking for 2025 and 2026. You can reach out to me on my website, casualcattleconversations.com. But with that, let's visit with Dave. Do you have big ambitions for your operation, but feel like you get so caught up in the day-to-day fires that you are just spinning in circles? You aren't alone. I've been in your shoes and know just how frustrating it can be. That's why I created Move the Ranch Forward. It's a guide for ranchers. This guide is a PDF that contains the exact process my husband and I use to stay focused on our goals throughout the year, even when life throws us curveballs. You can access Move the Ranch Forward today at casualcattleconversations.com. Well, Dave, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast and to visit with you again. You definitely are a wealth of knowledge when it comes to family businesses of all kinds. And we're going to talk about a conversation that hasn't necessarily been talked about specifically when I talk about the transition planning or estate planning pieces of family business for ranchers. So thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for the invitation. Always a pleasure.
So to start off, I'm curious, why do you believe in the beef industry?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm a fan of beef. Second, I believe it's probably the most resilient group of people in the world. And it's going to take that with all of the voices and challenges that the industry faces. In the end, the world needs protein. And I think the beef industry is going to do just fine.
Well, I appreciate that. It's fun to hear your perspective because usually I'm interviewing ranchers or people who have a different foothold and involvement in the industry. So it's fun to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, you need to get some city slickers perspective.
So you work with a lot of different families. And when you're working with those families and their businesses, how much time and importance are you placing on understanding the long-term goals that each generation has for the business?
It's actually quite a bit of time because ultimately, unless a family is clear on what their purpose is and where they desire to go, everything else is kind of irrelevant. So unless they have a clear path of what they want to accomplish as a family and how they want to do it as a family, there's a lot of time and money wasted by these families. And so, you need to spend the time on that. And I also think that, far too few families are focused on family continuity, meaning the relationships and investing in those relationships. And mostly they want to talk about business continuity. But ultimately, if the family relationships deteriorate, the business is going to go away too. So I try to remind them that they need to be investing as heavily in their relationships with each other so that they want to be in ownership together. They want to be in management together. Again, otherwise, it doesn't really matter what plans you put in place. It's going to disintegrate.
What can investing in those relationships with family look like?
So there's a couple things. One, I think a family needs to spend enough time together, maybe not working, maybe mix in a little bit of fun. I think it's important that there's, I would call this generational curiosity. So if the senior generation needs to be curious about what the dreams and aspirations of the rising generation are, and equally as important, I think the rising generation needs to consider learning about the history of their parents, what the farm ranch business means to them, so that they can then more easily honor the legacy that their parents and grandparents have established. So that generational curiosity, I think, is really important. But again, oftentimes we get so busy in the work that we forget that we need to have fun together. We need to continue to choose each other as friends, as business partners, and as siblings, if it may be that way. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you throwing that in there because I know that wasn't even something I was going to bring up, but that is definitely very important. So back to kind of understanding the long-term goals, and that does tie into, I think, kind of like you said, being curious about each generation's wishes and desires. What can that process look like for two generations to help understand their own goals? And then maybe later we can talk about understanding the other generation's goals.
Well, one of the first gaps that I see in most family farms or ranches is a lack of understanding across generations of the financials. If a family doesn't really understand their financials, they really shouldn't invite a rising generation back, because ultimately it will put the farm or ranch in jeopardy because there's maybe not the cash flow they need. But even worse than that, it's going to put the relationships in jeopardy when they come back and if they end up failing together. So I think figuring out what that cash flow looks like, allowing the rising generation to understand break-evens and the financials so that they can act like an owner, behave like an owner, even if they aren't yet an owner. I think we wait far too long to allow them into the realities of the risk, of personal guarantees, of the debt, the financial obligations that they're undertaking. But Shaye, I mean, it's normal, it's natural, because we're living with simultaneous roles. You know, we're maybe a parent, we're a sibling. As a parent, you know, we want to protect our kids against things that would hurt them. So we may be slow to share things that represent risk, and the lack of sharing is not going to allow them to be prepared to be an owner and understand exactly what the situation is for the farm or ranch.
So for the rising generation, if they are curious about maybe what the state of those financials are, and maybe there has been a little bit of a protective mindset from the senior generation, what tips do you have for them to approach that conversation so that they have an idea, hey, if I want to farm a ranch, is there a place for me here, or do I need to go somewhere else or do my own thing?
Well, I'm a huge fan of always thinking of the other first. So if I'm a rising gen and I am curious, I may switch my questions to, you know, when will I become an owner? How will I buy into a question like, you know, I want to make sure that you have the retirement cash flow that you need whenever it is that you choose to step away. So, you know, for me to understand the cash flow needs of the farm or ranch, and for me to understand the lifestyle expenses that you'll expect during your retirement years, I think will be helpful. So trying to step into the other person's shoes and some of the fears and anxieties that they may have in their own situation, rather than just asking questions on behalf of myself and my own goals and my own dreams. So again, I think a lot of it, if we can lead with empathy and with looking out for the other person, with the main goal of preserving relationships. So, you know, I want to understand the cash flows of the ranch, because ultimately I don't want to come back if it's going to not succeed and if our families aren't going to be able to have enough to live and continue to grow the ranch. So I would always bring it back to kind of the bigger family purpose rather than your own individualistic needs.
All right. So, you know, that's on the financial side that you just touched on. And so if a family is clear and open about that, and let's say there's two generations on a farm or ranch, and for example, maybe one generation wants to focus on scaling with what they're already doing. And there's another generation whose goal is maybe more to niche down, find different markets, and just live a little bit of a different lifestyle on the farm or ranch. How do you help each generation understand each other's wishes?
Yeah, I have a story with that. So I was working with a family just a few weeks ago, and they're in their third generation, and they've been clearly a growth-oriented company, not in the ag business, but I asked them, do you want to continue to be a growth company, or would you be more interested in taking a growth and income approach, or do you want to mostly focus on creating cash flow for the beneficiaries and for the generations? And it was wild to think that they had never even considered that they could be anything but a growth company. And so when you look at farms and ranches and all the different assets that these families have, most of them don't know that they have a choice. They oftentimes look at the operation and we just need more and more and more. And it could be that eliminating some things and focusing on fewer things might actually be better for the family and their situation. So, I think for every farm or ranch, we need to ask hard questions and then get clear on what the strategy is together so that there is alignment in our activities. Where there's not a clear strategy for who we are as a family and what our goals are, you're going to have varied strategies going through the minds of the different generations, and that oftentimes leads to conflict.
So, when you're talking about goals and strategies, are you talking about a series of like 1, 5, 10-year goals? Are you expanding that out to 20? I mean, what length of time are you helping families look into the future and try and set those strategies?
Yeah, we're working with some families that want to develop 100-year strategies, which is not even, you can't even imagine what that looks like. And so you always have to boil it down to the 1, 3, and 5 year because that's all that our minds can imagine. But thinking as how do we become a 100-year family, obviously you're going to make different decisions. Working with one family with that desire, they know that there's going to be exponential growth in the number of mouths to feed. And so they're going to have to grow. And looking at it in terms of the realities of can we even keep up with that kind of a growth trajectory? And saying, okay, well, I don't think we can grow at the same rate as the number of family members that are being developed, that are being born. And so there is some reality that needs to come into it as to what can the farm or ranch sustain, what expectations should every owner have for not only their relationship with the farm or ranch, but also cash flow expectations and how will they fulfill their own cash flow needs as individual families. So I think you have to start with, 1, 3, and 5 years probably. But, most families say we want to keep the ranch forever. And if that's the case, you're probably going to make some different decisions with, how you choose to own, the agreements that you make for how people get in and out of ownership. So it just depends on what the family's big goals are.
So, when you are helping families who maybe face some of those realities of maybe we can't sustain continuing to grow, or maybe we really do need to make a big shift, do you lean on going back to the family history from the beginning and looking at maybe how changes have been approached in the past to maybe say it's okay if we change now? How much of that family history is a part of this process?
Well, I love tapping into it because I think when we look at, where our family is and what we've done in the last 10 years, it may seem like we've done the same thing. But if you look back very far, you'll notice that there's been pivots along the way because of markets, because of family conditions, because of deaths in the family. So I think the historical perspective is a really good one, Shaye. And ultimately, families will have to change. They will have to innovate. They will have to do different things or do things in different ways to be able to meet the market conditions and to be able to meet their family situation. So embracing innovation and looking at it and deciding, how innovative do we want to be, not only to survive, but to become a destination spot for the rising generation that they want to come back to. So I'm a big believer that looking out into the past can also inform, some of the family's decisions going forward as they look to the future.
Tired of accounting software that wasn't built for ranching? Ambrook is the smart, simple tool that helps farmers and ranchers manage their finances like a pro. Is the pasture you're renting paying you back for the lease? Is your hay making or losing money, factoring in what you save for using it as feed? Is that old piece of equipment worth the maintenance costs? Ambrook can help you answer these questions and works on any computer or smartphone, so you can manage it on the go. Visit ambrook.com/casual cattle to try it for free for 1 month. That's ambrook.com/casual cattle. As you're working with the rising generation, maybe the millennials or Gen Z, or I can't remember the generation above millennials, but they could be considered rising too, depending on the family. Are they approaching family business differently than what you see with some of the senior generations?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, across industries, first of all, if you have a founding generation, many times they had very little growing up or starting in the business, and so they're used to going without, and the expectation that others will likely, trod the same path is there. And, when you're in the second generation or the third generation and you're somewhat removed from the founder's struggle, those expectations are going to be different. And I would say that the generation that's coming up now, they're maybe more focused on wanting to create a life and a lifestyle that they get to choose rather than do anything to be able to grow the farm, grow the ranch. So risk temperament might be there, might be different, but also just the desire to spend 100 hours in the farming operation and not be able to go to kids' games and things like that. I think this generation is wanting more of a balanced approach to their life. And so I think that can be a generational difference and can be a friction point.
Yeah, I see that too. And it is, even from my position compared to maybe my in-laws or my parents or my grandparents, because everyone's active on the operation. Everyone looks at it a little differently about what life should look like.
I have another example too with the farm family I'm working with. Very successful, and they've made huge sacrifices over time to get to the place where they are. And now the parents, they want to enjoy some of the fruits of their labor. And so they'd like to travel more. They'd like to go experience things off farm. And the rising generation wants to come with them. And so there is some friction around, well, yes, the rising generation has helped us to build what we have, but someone has got to stay behind to do the work. And so these lifestyle expectations that the rising generation are inheriting, I think that's particularly problematic because the rising generation oftentimes sees what their parents are currently doing today, the truck that they're driving today, the house they're living in today, and they want that maybe not now, but they want it in the very near future. And oftentimes those expectations are not realistic.
So how have you seen others, or how have you yourself helped the rising generation understand that it took their parents 30 to 50 years to get to this point, and it's not something that happens overnight for them?
It's tough. I mean, it's tough to just describe that, and it's not like a loving tap on the back, and saying, just wait. Because it's not a just wait. Honestly, I think maybe the rising generation doesn't have to wait as long if they strategically go about it. Because what most farmers and ranchers and business owners in general underestimate is the value of their relational capital. so the people that they know. And if a rising gen wants to grow faster than their parents think that they should, it may be that the relationships that their parents have allows that rising generation to get opportunities through other families that may not have a rising generation coming back to the operation. And so I really think that there's not enough time spent on the relational element of who do your parents know, who are the friends of your grandparents, what are the plans of the people that are in your town. And it may be that the biggest opportunities are not within your current family situation right now, but it may be that the relationships that your family members have with other families whose kids may not be rejoining the operation, those may represent the biggest opportunity for the rising generation to A, get into ownership quicker, but also B, be able to put their foot down on the accelerator and be in growth mode earlier.
That can be a big mental block too, not necessarily coming back to the family place if that's what you had in your mind, I would imagine.
Well, Shaye, one thing I've noticed is that, a lot of people that I work with, especially the rising generation, they say that they want to come back to the family operation, but then when you really dig into it, what most of them want is they want the same type of upbringing that for their now children that they grew up with. So it isn't necessarily that they'd have to farm the same dirt, but it may be that they want to raise their kids in the same community. And so that's kind of a light bulb moment when that happens, when there is that discovery that, hey, we don't have to all work on the same ground, but if we love the community and we want to be together as a family living in the same community, we can get really creative with how to do that.
So, what are some questions the senior generation can ask the younger generation to determine if they have someone from the rising generation that is fit to come back to the operation?
One of my favorite questions is, how do you feel about personally guaranteeing the debt of the farm? That's one of the great litmus tests for, do you have a rising generation that understands what it's like to be an owner? It may feel like an unfair question, but ultimately it's the reality of the situation. Most farms or ranches have financial obligations, they have leverage, and we don't teach our kids what leverage feels like. There's no way to manufacture what that feels like. So it may feel like a tough and unfair question, but I think it's one that needs to be asked, especially to those that are not going to come back and operate the farm or ranch, those that want to be in shared ownership with their siblings, that feel entitled to inherit the farm or ranch even though they're not going to be operators. I think the questions need to be asked of them, are they still going to be financially responsible for the success or failure of the farm or ranch? And most of them that are not coming back to the ranch do not want to take on that responsibility so their brother or sister can farm.
Now, I kind of skipped over it a little bit. Maybe I should ask this question first, but what questions should a person ask themselves to kind of dig into if they really desire to farm the same dirt or just be involved in the same community?
I think first of all, as a rising gen specifically, I think we need to look at ourselves and say, what are the skills, what are the unique talents, traits, relationships, connections that we have, so that whatever business we work in, whatever farm or ranch we join, is better off for us being there than not being there. If you can't answer that question, you're really not ready to join the family business, because the business needs to be better off for you being there than not. The next is, some are coming back to their family operations single, and others are already married and may have children. And so for those that are married, I think really spending a lot of time with the spouse and figuring out, what is it that we really want? Is it the community that we're after? Is it the fact that we want to live close to grandma and grandpa? Or is it truly that we want to farm the same dirt? Again, we don't usually slow down long enough to think about those things, but I think there's the other thing is, what financial expectations do we have for our little family? If you're married, if you have married and have one child, what are the financial expectations that you have to be able to have the lifestyle that you want to have? And then the question is, can the family provide that? And if not, do you have to supplement with someone working off farm, or do you look to other opportunities that may be in your same community that are more lucrative and can sustain the family goals that you have? So there's a lot that goes into it, Shaye.
And there's no silver bullet for every family, even though we'd all like one.
You got to be curious, though. You have to ask yourself some of the tough questions. And I think that generational empathy is really, really important to think about. If you're a rising generation, you need to think about your parents and what are the cash flow needs that they have so that they can take care of themselves. Because ultimately, if they can't take care of themselves, they can't be generous to the rising generation.
So in your experience working with family farms and ranches and businesses of all sorts, what do you see as the biggest threat to the family business continuing?
Mismatched expectations. So when you have multiple generations that don't expect the same things. And what goes into that is the lack of communication and transparency. If there's not good transparency as to the intentions of how ownership will pass, the intentions and expectations with how the rising gen will be compensated for their work, the lack of clarity with the cash flow needs of the senior generation, like all of those things, if those are not expressed, not explored, there'll be mismatched expectations, there'll be disappointment, and there may be fractures in the relationship. So, oftentimes families need facilitators to get to some of these questions because some of them are personal, and it can feel like, well, as a son or daughter, I don't want to ask my parents those questions. It feels rude, or it feels greedy, or it feels like I'm prying. But ultimately, if you're to become business partners, there needs to be great transparency and a path forward that both have similar expectations so that you can check in on those expectations over time and see if they're being met. And if they're not being met, you have something to talk about that is concrete and not just personal.
So for farmers and ranchers out there who maybe feel a little overwhelmed about even writing down or describing their own expectations or goals for 1, 3, and 5 years, what advice do you have for where they can start so it doesn't feel so overwhelming to think about?
This is a big question, where to start. Yeah, I mean, if I'm a senior generation and I'm talking about farm continuity, I have to be looking at cash flows. I shouldn't allow myself to even talk about farm continuity unless I'm going to look at the realities of it for myself and what the farm could even sustain. So, part of it is difficult because we're dealing with mortality, and, ultimately what we're asking a farmer or rancher to do when we ask them to put a succession plan in place or a continuity plan or contingency plans for ownership or management is we're asking them to plan for their obsolescence. We're asking them to plan for not when they're not needed. And that's brutal. That's a brutal reality of it. But the truth is, if the farmer cares more about the continuity and the future of the family operation than they do controlling it, then that's when a family has their great opportunity to perpetuate a business or a farm from one generation to the next. Where the desire to control outweighs the desire for continuity, there's not a lot that any advisor can do for a family. They're just simply not ready to put the work in.
Before we wrap up, are there any other topics that you think we should include in the conversation today?
Mothers. We should talk about mothers.
All right, let's talk about mothers.
I'm going to be banging this drum for the next 20 years of my life, but matriarchs are the difference between success and failure in a family business continuity situation. And I'll just say this, Shaye. The mothers are the story keepers. The mothers will influence how the children feel about the farm or ranch, whether they love it or whether it is in competition with attention, time. The mothers will likely be the ones that will first inherit the farm when farmer passes away. And so there's been far too little focus spent on the incredible women in agriculture and what their roles are and how powerful they are in terms of generational continuity. Because they're frankly the most invested in the family unit. They're the most in touch with how their children work together, fight together, play together. And so when anyone tries to put a plan together without the mother being in the middle and influencing how it works and why it works the way it does, I'm skeptical that it's going to work. So, Shaye, we need to get on the mom bandwagon for agriculture continuity, for the continuity of farms and ranches, and really celebrate them and encourage them to be fully involved with their voice at the table. And again, if you're working with an advisor that is not paying attention to the matriarchs, you may need to find other advisors. Is that bold enough? Is that bold enough for you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up. And that's something that even I see when we're talking about stuff on our family operation, and my mother-in-law is a part of the conversation, even though she wasn't necessarily, I mean, she helped on the farm, but it wasn't what she was mostly interested in. But it's a whole new perspective that is incredibly valuable to how we operate. And I grew up with a mother who was very involved on the family operation and very much has opinions and shares them. And it's really good that all of those are heard, because it brings a new dynamic to the conversation and can level everyone out if you're butting heads too.
It's a group, Shaye, that is extremely isolated, extremely private, very understated many times, often overlooked and underestimated. And this is a group that we need to be building programming for.
So it's kind of interesting you brought that up, because I interviewed Vance Crowe probably close to a year ago about how he is recording these family stories and family histories. And he talks about how there's a beautiful thing that happens after women get to that 55 or 60 range, where the filter just comes off and all the stories and opinions finally start coming out. So any other final advice for those farmers and ranchers out there listening who want to improve their chances of, well, I shouldn't say improve their chances, who want to continue their family relationships and continue the farm business and the family business?
I mean, my personal mission is to preserve families and perpetuate businesses. And you know this, Shaye, I've said it a million times, but it's in that order. So if you really want to preserve your farm or your ranch, first work on preserving your family relationships, investing time with those people that you love, communicating with them, creating expectations. And ultimately, if you have great relationships, you'll be able to have the hard conversations. If shared ownership is not a possibility, that's only a conversation that you can have where there's a trusting relationship that has been developed and cultivated over time. So do the hard work of developing the relationships that you have. I would also say for the senior generation, take an active role in discovering and cultivating the talents of your rising generation. And it may be that their talents are best served not in your operation. And if that's the case, have the courage to encourage them to spread their wings and to go and figure out what is their calling. So I'm extremely bullish on agriculture and on the family farm, but ultimately family farms, family businesses, family ranches will not succeed without great intentionality, without a huge level of care, and without the matriarchs at the center of the table.
All right. Well, folks, if you didn't hear that, go back and re-listen to it so that it sticks in your mind. And if you want to connect with Dave or any of the other resources mentioned in this episode, I will include links to that in the show notes. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your favorite podcasts is to share with a friend who could also benefit from it, or leave it a rating or review. But with that, happy ranching, folks.